So if we look in LPP source, you'll see that I have a 53TL12 SP2 image, I have a 61TL6 SP2, I have them all the way up to 71TL1 SP1, and then since I grabbed this, I think I've added the latest 7.1. You'll also see that under my spot directory, I have spots for all of those. I like to have my LPP sources and spots match, and I also have a BIO server spot. And then in my NIM images, these are what I call my golden mksysbs. If I want to install a AIX71 TL01 image, I will use the specific mksysb for that. And then you can see I've got a couple of disks in my NIM volume group. When I look at my NIM volume group, you can just see that I've got it across a couple of disks. You can see my PP sizes, etc. There's nothing particularly exciting there. And then you can see that in my NIM volume group I have 3 file systems. I actually have a /software, which is all of the software that I normally install, so I load all of my DVDs. I also will I will rip ISO images of the installed DVDs and load them in there, because you can now use the loop mount command to mount an ISO image as if it was a local CD. I'm really bad for losing CDs, so if I do this, I actually always have the ISO image and I never have to worry about losing them. And there's nothing worse than trying to get a copy of for instance, trying to get an AIX53 DVD today is very difficult because it's out of marketing, so you can't order them. So having the ISO images means you can go back and find them. Alright, some additional resources for NIM. We have scripts. You can actually set up a script that will run during an install or after an install to make sure that things are tailored. So you may have some additional security requirements, etc. You might want to add an additional page space or something like that. You can write scripts to do that. Then we have the BOSINS data files and the image data files, and these have to do with some of the information about how mirroring is going to be done, some of the installation things like default disk drives and so on. And then I mentioned earlier that we can do bundles. So we could have a golden image, and then we could have a bundle that is a bunch of things that I want to install separately. So I can lay out my OS, then I can go back and apply different bundles to make sure that I get DB2 or web servers or whatever added later. The other way I can deal with that is to simply have a web golden image. So you've got a couple of different options. The nice thing about NIM is it actually makes everything consistent. So if you have a golden image, everything you install from that golden image is going to look the same, which means you have to pay a lot of attention to how you set up those golden images. Because obviously if there's a mistake in it and you clone it, the mistake will be cloned. So in terms of the client machine, there's some fields that you're going to have to fill in. The first thing it's going to ask you for is hardware platform type. The default is CHRP, and that's basically what you're going to be using. I don't even know why they give you a choice now. You're going to tell it what kernel to use. Ever since 5.3, we've only shipped an MP kernel. And once you get to version 6 and higher of AIX, we only do 64-bit MP kernels. So you can pretty much guarantee that you're going to be doing an MP 64-bit kernel. I never fill in the network adapter hardware address, and I normally fill in all the IP parameters when I do the client boot because I'm doing a pull. There's very little here that you actually need to fill in when you're defining the client machine, because a lot of that stuff you'll fill in later on. I've defined a whole bunch of NIM resources here. So if you look at the output of this ls/nim, well, the first thing that you'll see, and let me just turn on annotating here. Here we go. All right, so first thing it tells me is that I have a master resource. Well, there's a surprise. You'll also see that I have a default NIM script, a default network defined, and a default boot image. Here's my LPP and spot for AIX63 and a matching mksysb. What I try to do is have the names match wherever I can. So my LPP spot and mksysb would normally have the underscore, and then I do 6.1 for the version, TL, and service pack. You'll see the same kind of thing with my 7.1s and so on. So you can see that you have a number of different resources that are defined here. Additionally, once you get NIM up, you're going to probably want to do a show mount -E to make sure that nothing's exported that shouldn't be. In this particular case here, I had set up B750R1 to have 7.1 TL0 SP3 installed to it. That is why you are seeing the /nim LPP source and the /nim/spot NFS exports. If you do a show mount -E and you see that /nim is being exported, then you need to go and look at why, because you should not be doing any exports to /NIM. NIM will do those for you when you actually tailor something to be installed. I can then do an ls nim-l of the actual LPAR, and here you can see the definition. So it's telling me it's a machine. I'm going to connect with nim-l. I'm using the chirp platform. You can see the 64-bit kernel there. You can see that it defaulted to the master network based on the IP addresses, and that it's waiting to do a BOS install. And then it gives me the resources that it's actually attached to it. So it tells me the LPP, the spot, and so on. So that's actually quite useful. And by the way, when a NIM install is happening, you can actually use the ls-nim-l command throughout the install to see the status and to get the LED codes. You do your initial define the resources, and then you basically want to update them. One of the ways to do it is you can put the update CD in or change into the fixes directory, and then you can update your spot and update your LPP source. So I learned a long time ago that there's a whole bunch of stuff I have to select in SMIDI if I want to do it that way. So in this page I've got some of the commands I use. If we look at the first command under the OR, we have the NIM define. What we're defining here is an LPP source. That's what the -t LPP source says. It's telling me that the location for that LPP is going to be /nim/LPP source and then the name of the LPP. And then the -a space source is telling me where I'm going to get the images from. So in this case, it's going to look in /software AIX version 7, AIX71 base. And then the very last piece is what I'm naming that LPP. So that's how I define it. Then if I want to update that LPP, I can now point using the NIM-0 update. I tell it packages equals all. Now I can just tell it individual packages here, but in this case I'm saying update them all. Alright, and then I've got the source, which is my source directory where I've got technology level 1, service pack 1, and then again I tell it which LPP I'm updating. Here I have the command for defining a spot, and in this case the spot is being defined from the LPP as a source. Now if this was a VIO server spot that I was defining, I would actually have the source be the mksysb image of the VIO server, because we don't have LPP sources for VIO servers. Updating the spot I normally do from SMIT because there's a whole bunch of install P flags that it sticks on the end, and it's just much easier to do that from SMIT-NIM. But you can certainly figure out the update A command and do it that way. At the very end, once I think it's set up, I use the NIM-0 check. I check my spot, I check my LPP. And then another command that you will definitely have to resort to using is if something goes wrong when you're doing your install, in order to be able to do anything with that LPAR later, we do a reset force that tells it to deallocate all the resources and so on so that you can then work with that LPAR. So how do you set up a client to restore from a mksysb? Well, first thing you do, and I call my client Gandalf, is you make sure that it's either in Etsy host or in DNS, because we have to be able to resolve the name. We then create that client to NIM as a machine object. So you'd go into SMIT-NIM, perform administrative tasks, manage machines, and then there'll be an option to define a machine. And there's only 3 things I normally select after I type the name in, and that's the kernel, the shell, and I always leave the network interface at n/a, unless I have multiple network interfaces like management interfaces and so on. The other thing I may do is go in and edit an image data, and the kind of reason that I might do that, for instance, is if I have a mirrored root VG, what I may do is go in, create an image data, put in there my logical volume managers. This is if I can put shrink equals yes and tell it to shrink down the file systems so that this would be a way I could reduce /USR, for instance. And I can put copies equals 1, 2, or 3. If I put copies equal 1, it's not going to mirror it. What I tend to do is I make sure that I take my mksysbs of unmirrored systems when I'm building my golden images. But if you actually have a mksysb of a mirrored image, by default it's going to use the image data that is in the mksysb. But if you specify one and actually allocate it at the time that you're doing the restore, for instance, or recreate, by putting copies equals 1, it won't use the mirror. and that means you don't have to have 2 disks, etc., to install to. So that's one of the main reasons people use a separate image data file. Setting mksysb up as a resource. In order to be able to restore from a mksysb, NIM has to build the relationship between the mksysb and a name. So typically what I do is I will copy the mksysb from /backups into /nim/images, and then what I'll do is go in and define the mksysb resource. You can do it a couple of ways. I've got the SMIDI way here, and I've also got the NIM-o define command. So we're defining a type mksysb, we're telling it where to find it, and at the end we're giving it a name. From now on within NIM, when I refer to mksysb underscore 71TL01SP1, or in the example above, the AIX61TL2SP2 mksysb, it will always know that it's referring to that specific location. What's nice about this is I can actually replace the actual mksysb image in /nim images without rebuilding the resource definition. If, for instance, I want to tweak something in that server and then have it still be my golden image, I could take a new mksysb, copy it over, use the same name, and it immediately replaces that one for the future. So now I want to tell NIM that for this LPAR machine I want to do a BOS installation. I'll go into SMIDI NIM BOS inst. It'll give me a drop down of all of the LPARs resources. I'll pick my Gandalf and I'll tell it that I want to install. I want to do an install from mksysb, and I will actually then give it the mksysb and spot as resources. If I have an LPP, I usually put it in there just in case it needs to grab something that it's missing. I tell it that yes, I'm going to accept the licenses because it's not going to work if I don't. But I also go down and I select no, not to initiate it now. If I don't select no, it will try to perform the mksysb restore. That's what we call a push install. So I make sure it's a pull resource and I set it to no. That means that I can go to the client now and boot from SMS mode to restore from that mksysb. It just gives me more control. And then down the bottom you can see that I have the option to use the NIM-o allocate to pre-allocate the resources, and then I can just tell NIM to do a BOS inst. And again, you've got the equivalent to the initiate now equals no is this boot underscore client equals no on the command. Okay, this is what it looks like in NIM. So you can see I've highlighted a couple of things there, but you'll see the installation target, that's the P6DB53A. That's the server I selected from the drop-down prior to coming in here. And then it's telling me it's doing a mksysb install type, etc. And down towards the bottom you'll see the initiate rebooted installation now. I've chosen a no, and I've also made sure that force push the installation says no. As you go further down, you can actually select additional file sets or additional bundles that you want to have installed so that it would install from the mksysb and then add a bundle afterwards if you wanted it to. So it's very flexible on what you can do. Here, when I do the ls-nim, you can see that it's ready for a NIM operation. It has an LPP source, a mksysb, and a spot allocated to it. This is one where you would probably have to use that NIM-o reset to deallocate things later. One of the things NIM does after the install is it does deallocate all of the resources.